Thank you. I think I gave Chelsea too much information there. Okay, let's kind of approach this subject from a very discovery point of view, because to be honest with you, this is a story that even for me as a consultant and a researcher whose job it is to go and seek out stories, this is a story that actually discovered me rather than the other way around. And I kind of want to give you an impression of the joy of discovery and that kind of route of discovery, because I think that's what makes this story the most interesting. It is a secret story. If you go online and try and look for the story of Asian seamen on Canadian ships in the First World War, you'll find absolutely nothing. And in fact, the archives in Canada, and particularly those in Victoria and Vancouver, are extremely silent on this particular subject. So to actually understand why the archives are silent and how I have kind of eased this story out from disparate archives around the world, as well as some of the archives here, I think is quite interesting in itself, and that's the kind of approach I want to take in this presentation. I will be open to questions and answers at the end, so if something comes up and you think, oh God, I've really got to remember that, please take a note of it, and I will do my best to answer it at the end. The story is still being uncovered. I've only been in Hong Kong for a few months, so I'm only just scratching the surface with newspaper accounts and other archives there. And every month I find something new. So if I gave this talk in another 5 months' time, it would be different. So let me just start off by saying that the role of Asians in Canada's Pacific coastline and in its history is quite interesting but largely forgotten. It of course goes right back to the 1790s and the Nootka Convention, with Asians coming to this part of the world on Russian, Spanish, British, French ships, but also ships of both Royal Navies as well as merchant ships. And one of the oldest references we have here dates from that particular period, and it's of the 50 Chinese men that actually built the first Western-style ship at Nootka. So we do have this tradition of Asians coming to the west coast of North America, the northwest coast of North America, on board ships as crewmen, as carpenters, and in various other capacities. When I say Asian, I of course am not using the common usage of Asian to mean East Asian, but actually the entire continent of Asia. And the representation of Asians arriving to this coast actually includes people from the subcontinent of India, from Southeast Asia, and from East Asia, China and Japan. And I guess my first hint at this hidden story, see if I can get this to work. I've got it the right way around. There we go. Perfect. Came from looking at a map, because I came here from England 2.5 years ago, and of course I wasn't very familiar with this part of the world, and I looked at the map. That's the actual map I looked at. And I realized that there were some places here with some names that probably kind of seemed out of place here. Why was this place called Ganges in the middle of the Straits, and Trincomalee, which of course is a city in Sri Lanka? And I suddenly realized that with my previous work on the East India Company, these are actually names of East India Company ships, but also of Royal Naval ships that were based in Bombay. And it brought me to think, well, why are these names on these Canadian maps? And that's where I started actually looking at the British presence in these waters, and how they related to Asia. Of course, in 1865, going back to the 19th century, the Royal Navy actually relocated to Esquimalt from Valparaiso in Chile, and that was its previous Pacific base. Kind of peculiar that its base was in the Spanish Empire and not in the British Empire, but at that time that seemed to be the best place to put it, because you entered the Pacific through the Straits of Magellan, and so that kind of made more sense to have their base closest to there. But as time went on, they decided to move it closer to their only North American Pacific coastal possession, which was Vancouver Island. Let's just move to the 20th century and Canada's naval countdown to the war. Several things happened at the beginning of the century that kind of shook the British Empire. One was the Russo-Japanese War. It was the first time that an Asian power had actually succeeded in defeating a European power after almost a century of European domination of the globe. And I guess to a certain extent, although it was the Russians that were defeated, it shook everybody else, particularly the Germans who had colonies in Asia. Qingdao, a famous beer-producing place, was one of their colonies, but they also had the Marianas and what is now Papua New Guinea, and several other places, Samoa, for example. But it also shook the French, who had their own colonies in Southeast Asia. And the British, of course, were aware that there was this sudden rise of Asia in the form of Japan. But the British were quite clever and had an agreement with the Japanese. Unfortunately, London actually felt that it had come to a period in time when the British Empire was too large for Britain to really totally rule the waves on her own, and she decided that the colonies needed to be part of that and not to be kind of, if you like, patrolled and guarded by the Royal Navy that they weren't actually paying into. So the British did push all of the dominions, and well, with one exception, India, surprisingly enough, which actually had its own navy stretching back to the 17th century. And to put it bluntly, Canada kind of sat on the sides. The Australian states separately decided to combine their forces and establish a navy. New Zealand decided it was far too small to actually have a navy, but it would contribute to a British ship as its contribution and pay for the sailors and the ship. Canada sort of sat on the side for quite a while, and then finally a naval bill was produced in 1909, which requested this development of a Canadian naval service, which would actually come under the Marine and Fisheries Department, and wasn't really looked at as something for defense, but more a kind of fishery protection, mainly protection against the United States incursioning on basically Canadian fisheries. But in the end, 1910 arrived, and it looked very like a war was on the horizon. I think everybody had kind of gathered that something was about to happen. So I think there's somebody trying to come in there, so maybe bring her in. The Royal Naval Service of Canada decided to buy two ocean-worthy vessels, the Rainbow and the Niobe. Now, I have to say that at this particular point of time, it was okay buying the vessels, but there were actually no sailors in Canada. The Canadian Naval College that was established in Halifax, which was actually previously a British college, wasn't actually producing enough sailors. The exception being Newfoundland, which was, of course, a separate entity at that time, and actually had a Royal Naval reserve force, which was quite large actually. The Niobe was not a great ship. The Rainbow was equally not a fantastically great ship, but it did arrive on the western shores of Canada in 1914 and was brought to Vancouver during the Komagata Maru incident, which I'm sure many of you have heard a lot about. But at the start of the war, Canada had just 379 naval officers and sailors, barely enough to actually manage one real strong ocean-going battleship. Let's now look at the Canadian Pacific Railway, because these two organizations actually come together in this story. And let's have a look at their development. So the Canadian Pacific Railway decided that it was actually going to be part of the British plan to encircle the globe with steam, both railway and ship, and make the British Empire one on which the sun really did not set, because you could actually go around the world following the setting sun on steam by either rail or by steamship. And as part of that plan, the connection between Asia and North America came to the Canadian Pacific Railway. And way back in the 19th century, that railway and its ships were already employing Chinese crewmen, as you can see from the panel above. By 1891, the railway company decided to actually upgrade its ships, and it actually sought to get the fastest, best ships that it possibly could. Made in Britain, it brought in 4 ships known as the Empress of China, Empress of Russia, Empress of Japan, and Empress of India. And these are what we call the Empress ships. There was one more, the Monteagle, that we would add to this sort of group. And when I started working on this project, I realized that the archives actually told me that in the 19th century, all of these ships had Chinese crew. In fact, up to 67% of the crew were Chinese. I also realized that most of this Chinese crew was recruited from Hong Kong, and that the ships were actually constructed in a way that would prepare them for use in case of a war. So there seemed to be some idea throughout the world that this war was looming and that these ships needed to be prepared in case of war. And there is this confidential letter from 1913 about, and it came from Bombay Castle, which is where the British fleet was based, and it itemized 2 classes of armed merchant ships that were to be armed merchant cruiser, this AMC, for conversion to man-of-war and merchant steamer armed for self-defense only. They were also going to be painted battleship grey, and they were going to have guns on it. And that particular piece of paper was to cover the ships of the P&O line as well as the Canadian Pacific Railway. Let me just move forward to explain a little bit about the railway. If you've been downstairs, you've probably got some idea of this, but if you haven't, when you go downstairs, you'll get a clearer idea. There were 2 types of ships, essentially. There were the Canadian Pacific Ocean Service ships, CPOS. I'm not going to use these terms because they're very confusing. I'm just going to stick to CPR and Empress because it just kind of simplifies the story. And there were the Empress ships and the Monteagle, and there's this wonderful model of one downstairs, the Empress of Japan. And then there were the familiar Princess ships, which were really for inshore waters. So I started looking at this, and I realized that all the archives were telling me was that there were Chinese and Japanese crew that were getting on and off ships of the Princess lines, but the archives were very silent on anything to do with the Empress lines. It showed the Empress lines coming to Vancouver. It showed passengers embarking and disembarking. It showed crew changes, but no Chinese crew. And curiously, very few non-Chinese crew. And I thought, well, this is kind of strange, because all the historical records show these 63, 67% Chinese crew on these ships. And of course, I then had to study a little bit about Canadian history and find out that that's because the Chinese were not actually allowed to step on the quay, let alone out of the harbour at either Victoria or Vancouver. They could be hung over the side to paint the ship, but they couldn't actually step on the quay. And then suddenly one particular record leapt out, and it was one particular Chinese person, a sailor who was at St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver and was being assigned to another ship of another line. But in the records it tells you what his previous ship was, and it was the Empress of China. And I thought, so in exceptional circumstances they are coming ashore. So I need to find another way of finding this story. So I kind of went back to school in some ways, and started to go online and look at records. And I suddenly found a record like this. Now this is a medal and awards roll from the National Archives in England. And what it actually shows is all these guys here, and as you can see, Choi, Chan, Chang, they're all Chinese. This particular part of the roll is actually just for Chinese people. These are their positions or ranks. This here are the ships that they were on, and these are the medals. So there's the Star Medal, the Victory Medal, and the British Medal there, all for the First World War that were awarded to these men. This is usually, and here is usually where it tells you that they were actually given the medal. Now if you actually look here under the name Choi, or Che I think that is there, you see Fireman, Empress of Japan. He was awarded the 3 medals there, but this is blank. And I started going through all of these records, and what I found out was these are the numbers of men that were awarded medals. Oops, sorry, go back a bit here. So what you have here is all the Chinese men on the Empress of Asia, Japan, Russia, and India. All the men that were Muslim names. These are non-Muslim, but from the Indian subcontinent. And then these ones here are Goans, so they're Portuguese nationals. And they have names very similar to mine. But what was kind of interesting was the sheer numbers of men that were awarded medals. And for every single one of these, that column of being actually given the medal is blank. So not a single one of these guys actually received their medals. But I also couldn't understand why the numbers were so high. But then I had to go back to the ships. So there's a lot of toing and froing with this story. And I went back, and looking at the Empress of Asia, roughly, the crew complement is roughly 350 people. So 300 of those would be Chinese. So you're actually looking at a change of crew here. You're looking at 2 crews within that 1 year of the first year of war. And you're looking at a change of crew, but both sets of crew received medals. What is interesting is, China didn't get into the war till quite late, and Portugal until almost the end of the war. So you had crew from 2 countries that were actually not at war on ships that were seconded to the Admiralty, Canadian ships, in a war capacity, but recognized by the Admiralty, but not actually being granted their medals. It of course raises lots of questions, but it also asks, what did these guys do? Where were they from? Did their families know? All kinds of things like that. And I'm still working on parts of that. But what I did do was take one of the smaller groups, because the numbers are so large that I can't actually get through all the number crunching of the details. And I just took the Goan crew, which are from the Portuguese colony of Goa in India, and looked at how they are recorded in terms of the work they did and their position. And what I noticed that almost half of them are general servants, which includes people as stewards, for example, on the ships. And the rest are almost, this entire group here are all kitchen people, butlers, butchers, bakers, etc. And very few people working as boilermen or oilmen or trimmers or anything like that. If I took a group of men from that same list with the surname Khan, which is a very popular Punjabi Muslim name, and I did the same study on them, half of them would turn out to be trimmers. So there was some sort of racialization going on in the Navy, in the Merchant Navy, as there was in the Royal Navy, and different ethnicities seemed to be designated different jobs on the ship. The same sort of thing actually happened with the Princess Line ships here in Canada, where the Chinese were usually cooks, and the Japanese were usually working in the engine rooms or oilers, and so there was this sort of differential in terms of occupation. So I was getting to get a better picture of what these guys were doing, where they were from, how they were hired, and what their role was. And then a peculiar thing cropped up. One of the names that came up in the medal rolls was this guy, Ip Yi, who I later found out through the Commonwealth War Graves Commission had died while the ship was in Colombo. That raised a whole new flag for me, because suddenly the ship was now in the Indian Ocean and no longer in the Pacific. Up to now, I thought that these ships were only going to be going back and forth between Vancouver and Hong Kong and Yokohama. Suddenly there's a ship in Colombo. There's a sailor that's a trimmer and has died on the ship. And I got one of my colleagues from the Underwater Archaeology Department to Sri Lanka to go across the road to the cemetery and take a photo of this grave. I was so excited about it because I actually, for the first time, had real rock-hard evidence of these guys and this story. Oops, let me just go back. So what I decided to do was to look at each ship and track the ship's movement. To do that, I actually had to go down to Australia, because they actually had all the charts of the ships in the First World War, and they had a full listing of the Emperor's ships. So going back there, these are some of the points that came up from that study. So just look at the Empress of Asia, and you get this whole series of events. So it was involved in the taking of Tsingtao from the Germans, in the blockade of German vessels in Manila, convoy duty. By the way, that convoy duty was for Anzac troops from Australia going up the Red Sea to Suez. And then it was at Diego Garcia Colombo. Then it takes the 230 Germans who were prisoners from the Emden, and that had been sunk by the Royal Australian Navy's Sydney ship. And it was like a big thing for Australia, because it was their first time that they had a ship and their own navy, and this ship had knocked down a German battle cruiser, and it's a real big thing for the Australians. And you know, there's this Canadian ship right beside them. It was also based in Aden, which was very important because that guarded the entrance to the Red Sea and all British goods going up into the Mediterranean, particularly for support of the Anzac troops at Gallipoli. Then in 1915, they were replaced by, the Chinese crew were replaced by a South Asian crew. Now that makes sense. That's why we have those British Asian, British Indian and Portuguese Indian crew there. So things are beginning to make sense with those records now. And then finally in 1915 it prepares to return to Hong Kong, goes on to normal service, but then it has a new role from 1917. It's involved, CLC is Chinese Labour Corps. It's involved in this secret shipment of thousands of Chinese men, mainly recruited in northern China, bringing them over by ship secretly to Port Moody, putting them onto cattle wagons and shipping them across Canada on bond by the British government because of the Chinese head tax, all the way to the Atlantic coast and then shipping them on the other Empress ships, the Empress of Ireland, for example, across to Europe. It's also later involved in carrying the troops, the US troops to France and bringing the Canadian troops back. So there's a whole war story with these ships that's hardly noticed. Let's look at the Empress Russia. This time I struck lucky because I actually had visuals. I had these fantastic images which you can go and see. They're part of the Chen collection downstairs and they're on display there. This one, sorry, I'll go back. This one here is not. It's on loan from the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic at Halifax, but it's of the Empress of Russia in this rather attractive dazzle camouflage that was produced by, I think it was the St. Martin's School in London. Didn't really work, to be honest, but unless you had them all lined up against each other. And then you have photographs like this. So this is the Emden wounded being brought to show. This is very interesting because you see in the background there's a Chinese person there. There's another one there that's not so clear. But these guys with the pom-poms on their hats are a French crew taken on from what is now Vietnam because there was a lack of British gunners in Southeast Asia. And then the Empress of Russia, very similar sort of affairs. Again, the transshipment of the Emden, again a change in 1915 to a South Asian crew. Again, the same role in delivering Chinese Labour Corps to Williams Head, which is by the Esquimalt base in Vancouver Island, and again involved in sort of taking troops home. And if I go to the Empress of Japan, I actually found this in a book, which is the complement of the ship. And it's very interesting, this whole block here, which are the larger numbers, as you can see. So you've got Chinese firemen, Chinese waiters, Chinese sailors, then you've got these French sailors, Royal Navy blue jackets to offer the defense part of the ship. What this has left out is the Pathan, Muslims from what is now Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, who were also on this ship. So a very international crew, and a similar kind of story in terms of the movements of that ship. The Empress of India was quite an interesting one because it was requisitioned by the Admiralty, but the Maharaja of Gwalior actually bought the ship, paid for its running, paid for its crew, turned it at his cost into a hospital ship called the Loyalty, and it functioned as that throughout the war. taking care of both British and Indian troops throughout the war. But it also retained some of the Chinese troops on it. It never came back to service as an emperor's ship, so it later got scrapped and it was sold and kind of disappears, which explains the low numbers of Chinese people on board that ship in that chart I showed you earlier. So those charts are starting to make sense now as I look at each ship. And then that's the Monteagle, pretty much the same kind of story. I'll just notice that some of you are still reading that, so I won't move past it. But it's the same line of story. It's used as a trooping ship and then to deliver the Chinese Labour Corps. It's worth noticing here the numbers of the Labour Corps that have been shifted. And that leads me to the next point, which is the Chinese Labour Corps. I don't think I could talk about this story without talking about the Chinese Labour Corps. Almost 100,000 Chinese Labour Corps served in the First World War. The first contingent were actually moved by the French. It was an agreement between the Allies and the Chinese nationalist government that allowed that to actually happen. But their job was supposed to be to work beyond the battle lines and mainly in supply roles. A very difficult duty to actually do on the Western Front because the supply roads come right up to the actual front, and the use of mustard gas, the use of shells in the Western Front was quite horrific. And I've actually seen a collection of images of the Chinese Labour Corps who were injured that was held in a hospital in London not far from where I lived. And the images are too gory for me to actually put up for you. They're really horrific. But what it does tell you is their actual stories as individual people, which we actually have very few of. So that's kind of filling in a few more gaps. So why did the Chinese suddenly decide that they weren't going to work on the ships? What made them decide that, and why were these Indian crew taken on? And that actually goes to this event here, when the ship carrying these Chinese Labour Corps went down in Malta with a loss of between 400 and 600 Chinese Labour Corps, but also almost its entire crew. And it was at that point that the Chinese crew said, you know, we didn't sign up to be at the front. And most of these guys couldn't swim. So that's when they said, we're going back home now. You know, if you want to take the Chinese Labour Corps, you do it with another crew. And that you started getting the Indian crew on board. And again, all of that happens before China actually declares war on Germany. And then at the time of the armistice, there were 96,000 Chinese Labour Corps in Europe. And they were still at work in 1919. So you're going to ask me, well, what sort of other work did they do? Well, the First World War was really horrific. If you've ever seen any of the imagery from the war, you'll know that it was dead animals, dead people, rats and muck, lots and lots of muck. And with all of that, you also had all this shelling. Well, it was up to the Labour Corps to go in there and dig out the bodies and bury them. So a lot of the Canadian soldiers were actually buried by these guys. And it is a very sad story, not because of what they did, but because it has really been not remembered by either China or anybody else until very, very recently. And there is a movement in the UK to actually set up a monument to the Chinese Labour Corps. So how were these guys transported? Well, they were brought into William's Head, transferred onto those princess ships, taken out across the straits, avoiding Vancouver City, down there and into Port Moody. And that's how they avoided them being in the public eye. And then shipped on these cattle wagons. Each wagon had 20 men in it, and each wagon was armed. They had an armed guard. And that's how they were shipped across Canada. And the CPR ships, you know, we were getting these large numbers. Well, I've managed to break down who shipped who, and the actual CPR shipped 45% of the Chinese Labour Corps across Canada and across the Pacific, as well as across the Atlantic. And other lines like the Dollar lines, as well as the P&O ships. There were 2 P&O ships doing this as well. So, my conclusion. The Canadian Pacific Railway vessels at war. So, I've told you the number of ships, but what I've done is here is nicely broken down what they were doing in terms of functions. They were part of the China Station, and the job was trooping, patrolling, and blockading. The crew were mainly Hong Kong Chinese with some French. Then, between December 1914 and September 1916, they moved to the East Indies Station, which with its base in Bombay and also in Trincomalee. And the job there was support activities, particularly around Aden. There are some wonderful photographs of this. Of them with patrol boats in Aden, with boats with Indian troops going to take lighthouses. Now, Aden, of course, was itself under attack from the Turks. So if the Turks had taken over Aden, there's no way these Australian troops could get to Gallipoli. So it was very, very important to hold on to Aden. And so their job there was actually crucial to the war effort. And in that case, they took on these British and Portuguese nationals. You also had them for that period between October 1916 and 1917 when they came back to normal runs. Now, when I say normal runs, they are, of course, taking food materials across the Pacific as part of the war effort. So it's not normal as in your normal goods, but they are actually part of the war effort. And then they go back to a wartime activity with the Chinese Labour Corps between 1917 and 1918, and then they're responsible for bringing the troops home. And just about a month ago, I discovered these wonderful images in the Vancouver City Archives of the ships coming back with all the men all over the railings of the ships and that sort of thing. Really beautiful pictures. I think we have a couple of them downstairs, Chelsea, yeah? So you can go and have a look at those later. They're not actually in the presentation. And I just wanted to acknowledge some of the people that have been helping me uncover this story. The list seems to get longer month by month, but I'm quite delighted that I've managed to pull the story together from all these disparate sources. And I think that's enough talking right now. I'm about ready for questions and answers.
We have plenty of time for questions, but
Thank you.
Cam.
Yes.
Hi, Clifford.
Hi.
I just wanted to add a little bit to your CLC
Sure.
narrative. There's a correctional institute in Victoria called the Wilkinson Road Correctional Institution, a jail. And in that property, there's a section that was discovered about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe longer, where many of the CLC men who were brought over were buried. And about 3 or 4 years ago, the folks from the Chinese Canadian Military Museum here in Vancouver went over, and with the cooperation and help of the warden of the Correctional Institute, a number of prisoners helped to restore that cemetery. And it's a very nice setup. It's it's on its own, but there's quite a few men that are buried there, long forgotten, but now remembered.
I believe also, Cameron, that the custodians of that site have kind of been briefed about it, because I know people have gone over from China and have been taken around the site as well.
Right.
But I also know that there are some really good records of personal stories of people living in Victoria who somehow managed to go and see these men when they arrived there. And there's a very touching story in one of the books I read of a young girl who used to go with her parents. I think her father was a doctor. And she describes how these Chinese men were very homesick for their families, and they had children at home and the like. And they used to make these little wooden framed kind of stages and have little puppet shows for the kids. And she was one of the kids that used to go and watch them. And actually, I was at MOA watching the Taiwanese puppet show this weekend, and it kind of reminded me of the same sort of thing. So there was some interaction between the CLC and the locals, and luckily we do have those memories and people have recorded them. There's also been a film documentary produced by a Chinese film company that has picked up those stories, including one of the doctor who accompanied the soldiers on the trains as they were crossing Canada. And it kind of gives you this character who was actually quite sympathetic to the Chinese soldiers. And you can clearly see that he was the kind of guy who would take his daughter over there. But most other people just kept away, those who knew about it. Most people had no idea what was going on, and certainly of the numbers that were involved. But the story is being fleshed out at the moment, and the Chinese are finally actually taking an interest in this story. In the People's Republic are actually trying to find out more about what went on. Any more questions? Yes, Chelsea.
So could you talk a little about, because I know that you've made some efforts to try to sort of posthumously make sure that families of the Chinese who participated in the war received the medals that they'd actually been awarded?
Yeah, I did try and find out why it was a case of the medals not being delivered. And so what I had to actually do is to look at how the British Admiralty ran that system of awarding medals and delivering them. Well, the awarding of the medals was made by the British Admiralty, and they were based on whether they were actually active in a war capacity and in a war zone. There were different categories of medals for different types of services. The actual delivery of the medal was up to the shipping company. So it seems that it was up to the CPR to deliver the medals to the men, but that never seems to have happened. I'm still trying to find out in Hong Kong whether people there were actually aware that their menfolk had received the medals. And although I've only just found out one or two people that have any memory of their grandfathers being in this war, it seems that they didn't even know that they were awarded the medals in the first place. So there's an absence of information on the family side. There's also a total blank on the Canadian side. It was very interesting with your talk, Cameron, because you were talking about people in the Second World War whose role as Canadian nationals was, struggling to be recognized. But here we have people who are foreign nationals on Canadian ships, and their role is just blanked out, basically. A question that's come up very often is, why was it blanked out of history? And I struggled with that because I tried very hard to get information on this. When I contacted the Canadian Navy, I was told, and I have this in writing, no Asians served on Canadian ships in the First or the Second World War. But if you have any information, please pass it on to me. Of course, I didn't bother answering back, but I did ask the Esquimalt base if they would like to host the display that we have downstairs, because I don't want this you and me point of view, and this story is becoming more and more public, and they turned down the offer. So the gesture was made, but I haven't had healthy response to it. So I think part of the question with memory is who is remembering. Most of the, what can I say, memorials in BC to the First World War, and particularly to the role of the merchant or the Royal Navies in the First World War, were actually set up by such organizations as the Native Sons of BC. And these were exactly the people that were behind the imposition of the Asian Exclusion Acts. So to actually remember the role of these men was to somehow give in to their rights to arrive in Canada. And I think that's the reason that it was kept up. But it kind of requires you to understand the social life of Canada as well as the military history at the same time, because you can't separate the two. Any other questions? Tom?
I was quite surprised to see that they were still taking American soldiers to France in 1919.
Yeah.
That was, you would think that the traffic would be
going the other way.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly why that is. I too kind of found that particular one. I had to go back to my notes and said, did I get that right? But it seems that there was still a trickle of people going over, and I think it's just part of the rebuilding, or maybe prisoners, or what, I'm not sure. Did you have some input on that?
That could be that, excuse me, post-war 1918, 1919, 1920, there was a huge effort by the American government to attempt, just like the earlier version of the Marshall Plan in World War II,
yes,
where they attempted to assist, particularly Belgium.
Yeah.
And the man who headed it up, interestingly enough, was Herbert Hoover.
Right.
Before he became president of the United States. He was assigned, he was the boss of this big effort to help to rehabilitate Europe. And it could very well be that these people were shipped over in 1919 at the height of the great influenza pandemic.
Yes.
That might be part of the answer, I don't know.
I mean, I know that...
The Americans definitely were involved in 1919 and 1920 in trying to restore Europe.
Could have changed history if they'd done a more comprehensive job.
Well, they didn't count on the little guy from the little corporal
from Austria.
Yes, but I think also at the same time in 1919, as Europe's frontiers were being redrawn, especially in the Balkans and the former Ottoman Empire, there was a lot of to-in and fro-in of people. I mean, literally thousands of people Greeks were moving from what is now Turkey to Greece, and Turks the other way, and that all needed policing in a Europe which had lost so many men, basically. So there was clearly a role for the Americans in policing at that time. But I don't actually have the details of what these men actually were, or who they were, and what they were being assigned to do. But I too raised that, and I thought, oh, let me go back to my notes. This doesn't quite make sense. And then I realized that that's what they actually say. Any other questions?
I do have, actually. Because when we were back on that pie chart with the occupations of the sailors on the boats, and like a trimmer, I don't know, trim the sails, but these aren't sailing ships. So
okay.
There's a trimmer, and there was one outlier up the top, like 1%, which was like a plunker or something.
We can go back to it if you want. A punker boy.
A punk boy?
Yes.
Okay, so there's two.
There's two, okay. Well, they're
reasonably well informed, but these are, I'm not...
That one.
Yeah,
okay.
A punker boy.
Okay, let me deal with the first one, which was the trimmer, wasn't it? I think
it's not there,
but I mentioned it. Yeah.
Trimmers.
Okay, a trimmer, yes. A trimmer it's a difficult job to explain, but these are coal ships, and in the hold for the coal, you've got this mound of coal.
Right.
what happens is when the ship is at sea and needs to keep its balance, the coal
Gotta shift
has
the
to
load.
stop moving around. So if you start like digging out the coal, it's going to roll around. So their job was to trim the coal to a level.
Ah,
That's why they were called coal trimmers. Actually, what they did was also excavate the coal for the boilers,
yeah.
right? The punker boy,
Bit of black lung going on.
yeah, lots of black lung.
Yeah.
The punker boy is a very interesting term. It comes from India, and it was the guy who put his foot on a pedal and made the fans work for the British Raj. And I noticed that, I don't know if they still have it, but if you go to, because they've been redoing it, but is it the Tiger Lounge in the Empress Hotel? And it had these big fans on the ceiling. Well, there would be a rope coming down the side, and this guy would pull that, and once he got fed up of pulling it, he would tie it to his feet and just do that with it, and that's how the fan went. And that's the punker boy.
Well, I know.
Okay. There are other things. There's a donkey boy, for example, which is for a little crane, a kind of winch for unloading. So there's a whole group of terms. There's another term there that you may not be familiar with, the top ass.
Yeah, no.
Who is the guy that's the leader of a gang of Asian workers. Usually he was the guy that spoke the best English, and if they didn't speak English, and then he would act as the kind of manager of the gang. So there are a number of colonial terms here, that most of which come from British India and most of which came from the East India Company. Any? Yes, sorry.
So I was wondering about a couple things related, but you mentioned that the British were now contemplating establishing a memorial for this CLC.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking about the website that you would work on, the Whose Remembrance Project, and how that allows people to sort of crowdsource information. And I was wondering if you think that there would ever be a point where the stories of the CLC and the other Asian crewmen could be brought to light by having that sort of public venue in which people can contribute their memories or their family's history to try to give us a fuller picture of what these folks did.
Okay, maybe I should explain
Sure, yeah,
what.
please do,
So the Imperial War Museum in London have a project called Whose Memory, and the idea was to look at the fact that the memory of the First World War is kind of skewered. It's certainly skewered in Canada, because we just know about the Western Front and very little else in Canada. Cameron did a wonderful talk yesterday about last week about the Second World War, but also the talk on Thursday, and we're dealing with stories. For example, the story of Canadian women as nurses in the Middle East and in Gallipoli in the First World War is totally unknown, because the national story is all about the Western Front, right? And similarly, the Australian story is just about Anzac and Gallipoli and nothing else, nothing about the Marianas or New Guinea or the Emden, except if you're a sailor, then you know all about that. And so we raised this issue with the Imperial War Museum, and we basically said, as members of the public, that these stories have become very kind of iconic in a way, and as a result, they're not covering everybody's story, and certainly everybody's historical story, and they need to be dismantled and made more equal, more demographic, more democratic, perhaps is the right term. So how are we going to do this? And we came up with an idea of having a website where all the current records that are held in Britain, and mainly in the National Archives, could be put online. And they wouldn't just be British troops, they would be all Allied troops of the British Empire. And they wouldn't just be troops, they would be the nurses and the nursing auxiliary and all of those groups as well as these merchant seamen who were in a war capacity. And then the public are invited to look up an ancestor, find their record on this database and add to it. So you can add an image, a photograph, your little brass box, your little Queen Mary's box from the First World War that was given to British and colonial troops. You could add medals that are part of your family collection. And you could add the family stories so that we get a better idea of the impact of war on families. And so this project has been going on now for 2 years. We're slowly beginning to get some of those more difficult stories, particularly from Africa and places like that, to fill in. The trouble is that we are struggling with the CLC because all we have is the hospital records of those that were hospitalized. For the bulk of them, we actually have hardly any records. So there is an aim at the moment to work with the Chinese government, who do have some of each man had like a little pass that gave their name and where they were from and a kind of number that they were assigned. And some of these have survived. So we're trying to put those on first and then build up from that. So that's the project that's underway. And just today, it's been announced that the project was given an award for being one of the best remembrance projects of the First World War, which is really good news.
What is the website?
It's, if you just Google Whose Remembrance and Imperial War, Whose Remembrance and Imperial War Museum, it should come up. Any more questions? Kamchi.
This is not actually a question, just an observation.
Yeah.
That we spoke about the different jobs that different nationalities did back then. We've just been on a cruise over the summer to Alaska, and there too, all the people that cleaned the rooms were Indonesian, and then the people that worked in the restaurants were all Filipino. And they were specifically chosen for those jobs, so there's still that going on.
There's still a hierarchy.
I don't know why, but
yes,
it is that way still.
It's certainly like that in cruise ships. I mean, it was when I was working on this, and I was at the Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax, and I happened to be looking for a Wi-Fi zone. And the nearest Wi-Fi zone to the museum is actually by the quayside where all the liners come in. And suddenly I noticed that there's this whole batch of people behind me all trying to get on Wi-Fi. And I started talking to them, and I was amazed because all of the waiters working in the Atlantic on those cruise ships were all from Goa, from where my ancestors came from, but I couldn't speak their language. So we were just talking about, sort of saying, what do you do and where have you come from and this sort of thing. They were delighted that I'd been there and knew their villages and that sort of thing. But there still is a hierarchy on board the ships. In the British Navy, the hierarchy was also one that could be translated, if you like, from one sea to another. So in the earlier days, the people that worked as stokers and coalers and trimmers in the Indian Ocean tended to be from the Punjab or Somalia, because they were just seen as bigger guys, and it was thought that they could deal with the heat better. But when you got into the Atlantic, they were known as crewmen, and they were from the coast of what is now Liberia and Sierra Leone, or from St. Helena, which had a population that was badly in need of work. And then in the same way, if you had Filipinos working in the kitchen in the Pacific, and you had Goans in the Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean, you had the Maltese. So there was always this categorization of these different racial groups into different purposes or jobs on these ships, and it's still very much there today.
I guess I have one last question.
Sure.
So how are you continuing this research, or what is sort of the next piece that you're hoping to uncover?
The next piece I'm hoping to uncover is, now that I'm in Hong Kong, as it happens, it's actually the perfect place for the next piece. So I'm trying to get one of the Hong Kong museums on board with this, because what I need is publicity in Hong Kong so that Hong Kong families who have this story in their sort of family memory come forward and actually contribute to it. The only way I can do that is by somehow getting it into the public realm, maybe with newspapers and that sort of thing. There is somebody in Britain that's sort of suggested a book, but this story, to me, belongs in two places. It belongs in Hong Kong and it belongs in Vancouver, because the ships were from here and because the crewmen were from there. In many ways, it actually binds these two cities very closely together, but it needs more exposure for people to really understand that connection. And it's a connection that we don't make. Unfortunately, 100 years of history has worked against that connection. It's worked to try and break that connection. But I think it's the 21st century. It's time to go the other way. So my aim in Hong Kong is to work to get it better known there.
Does anybody have any last questions? All right, well then, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.